Thank you for being with us here today. My name is Tarang, and I'm a second-year student at SIPA and a research assistant for Professor Healy. Over the summer, I helped him work on this project on how to make cyberspace more defensible. So I'm very excited to be here today with all of you. Our next and the last panel for the conference is on regulating cybersecurity for the energy transition, which will be moderated by Krejsa. So over to Harry.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Columbia University, to SIPA, and everyone here today, and of course to our fantastic panelists. I think this is going to be a wonderful conversation. As I mentioned, I'm Harry Krejsa. I am the Director of Studies at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, and until earlier this fall, I was the Assistant National Cyber Director for Strategy at the White House, and before that at the Pentagon, working on the Trump administration's defense cyber strategy. And so I have seen firsthand a lot of the conversation over the last couple of days about more continuity than discontinuity in cyber policy over the last couple of administrations, really last several administrations. It is a field that has benefited dramatically from a arc of iteration rather than a yo-yo of dramatic reversal. And I think the role of civil society and industry in cyber policy in particular has played a critical role of ballast, if you will, in that arc of iteration. And that's why I'm excited for the great panel we have today representing that spectrum of government, civil society, and industry to have this great conversation. So I'd love to do a quick round of introductions to the rest of our panel here, and then we'll kick it off. Sean, do you want to start?
Sure. All right, this is working. I'm Sean Ewart. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Energy in Governor Hochul's office. So in that role, we sort of focus on the day-to-day operations of our energy agencies and authorities in New York. So that includes the Long Power Authority, the New York Power Authority, the Department of Public Service, and the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So I've been in this role for a little over 3 years, and then prior to that, I spent some time in the state legislature working on energy issues, including security. So it's nice to be here.
I'm Michele, Guido, Southern Company, the Strategic Security Policy Director. I am responsible in this role for national security, cyber, physical, natural disasters, anything to do with resilience and reliability within Southern Company, and then probably more from a portfolio for industry in the energy sector. Work very closely with finance and communications. Know many up here. I worked with Harry on the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. My former CEO, Tom Fanning, was a private citizen on the commission. So you probably have seen many of the recommendations that have rolled out and have been implemented into law. And it's just a great pleasure to be here, and I look forward to the conversation. I'm looking forward to the questions that you may have for us.
Hi, I'm Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor of practice here at SIPA. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and been doing that I started the center 12 years ago, and before that served in government, most recently with the energy and climate portfolio in the Obama White House at the National Security Council. So a lot of the work of the center and my own background is at the intersection of national security, geopolitics, foreign policy, and energy and the energy transition. But I'm probably the least knowledgeable person here about cybersecurity in particular, so mostly I'm just excited to learn about that, and maybe from Sean about congestion pricing, but I can bother him about that later.
That's right, John. Are EVs going to get extra dispensation on the congestion pricing?
Stay tuned.
Great. So as we were talking earlier about how the arc of cyber policy is long, but has more continuity than discontinuity to it, right? And I think that there's a number of reasons why it's been so collaborative and iterative there. And one is that even though the nature of the threat changes, changes and the tactics, techniques, and procedures of threat actors evolve over time, the intent and motivations behind them are enduring. And so we change, we evolve. The questions about regulation and policy keep getting updated and renewed, but the fact that this is a space in which bad guys want to do bad things does not fundamentally change. And I think that the energy ecosystem is a great illustration of this, of what endures even when there is tremendous change and transition. The energy system is a part of our critical infrastructure that just has to work. You heard in the prior panel on healthcare cybersecurity about how a couple things not working starts resulting in people dying very quickly. And electricity and our broader energy ecosystem is one of those as well. Like society will start showing its cracks if it is not working. And that makes it an attractive target for threat actors who want to cause problems, who want to create those cracks. We've seen it in non-state actors with ransomware attacks. We remember Colonial Pipeline, which was certainly a watershed event in cyber policy and the energy ecosystem. But we also have seen more recent news and disclosures about state-backed actors, notably Volt Typhoon and others working on behalf of the People's Republic of China to pre-position disruptive and destructive capabilities on the U.S. energy ecosystem to hold our critical infrastructure at risk in a time of crisis. And you've seen senior leaders in government put out reports, testify before Congress, and partner with Microsoft on some of their recent threat intelligence disclosures about how these are efforts by governments to be able to not only disrupt the United States' ability to mobilize in the event of a conflict, but also to provoke chaos and panic, and thus harm our ability and will to endure. So that is all, while the techniques and specific examples of that are relatively new, the intent behind it is not. That's the kind of thing we've known that the PRC and other competitors have been interested in doing for some time. But of course now layer on a new variable of dynamism, and that is the energy transition. The couple of the only existential threats to Americans' way of life are great power conflict and climate change. And they are increasingly intermingling. And the energy transition is providing both new sources of hope and innovation against those challenges and novel cybersecurity considerations. The clean energy transition is providing a huge impetus for modernization across our critical infrastructure that was never designed to be as digitized as it is now, and clean energy is providing a vehicle for much more technically sophisticated and theoretically inherently more defensible technologies that are more digitally native to kind of strengthen our defenses against threat actors. It also, that energy transition is also bringing a proliferation of connectivity. That inherently more digitally interconnected ecosystem is going to dramatically expand the number and variety of internet-connected devices on our critical infrastructure. So it's going to cut both ways, like great promise and potential for significant complication. And it's all happening in the ecosystem of in the context of the first significant electricity load growth in quite some time. And these are all exciting, interesting, new challenges that we're facing here, and we've got like the perfect panel to discuss it. And so first I wanted to hand it over to Jason to discuss the state of play with that transition, the big dynamics underway, and how we should think about that in the context of the coming government transition.
Thanks.
Oh, you gave such a good overview. You've kind of answered any question I think we could address for the next 30 minutes or so. But and your introduction about resilience, obviously cyber, one piece of that. There are others, natural disasters, and those are getting worse in part because of climate change. Was reminding me of, I had accepted the offer to join the Columbia faculty. Academic year starts in September 2012. That was when President Obama was just about to finish his first term, and at the last minute they had said, "Can you stay till Inauguration Day?" So I had about a few months of commuting until January of 2013. And for those who may remember, something happened in the middle, which was, right, so I was in New York, kind of half working remotely and half getting to DC 3 or 4 days a week when Superstorm Sandy hit. And one of the things I remember managing that crisis was like at some point just getting in my car and driving around New York to figure out what was happening at gasoline stations because we had such poor information to understand the availability of fuel supplies. If electricity was the problem, if the Port of New York access was the problem, and everything else. So there's so many things we have to do to harden our infrastructure. And I was just thinking about that as you were giving your intro. I'll start with like a 30,000 super high-level view of where we are in the energy transition because I think it's important to remember the scale and magnitude of the undertaking we are trying to pursue here. And as a result of that, two things can be true at the same time. So the pace of growth in clean energy globally, I'm thinking with a global perspective, is staggering, remarkable. This year, about twice as much will be spent globally on clean energy as on fossil fuels, $2 trillion to $1 trillion. In 2020, 1 in 20 cars sold globally was electric. This year it'll be around 1 in 5. 2/3 of the new electricity generation capacity added around the world last year was renewable. And if you look over the last 10, 15 years, the cost of solar down more than 90%, wind down 70 to 80%, batteries down 90%. Like on every dimension you could imagine, if you had gone back 10 years and asked someone where would we be on cost, where would we be on annual growth rates, we're sort of exceeding many people's wildest expectations. And this year, oil use will go up, and gas use will go up, and coal use will go up, and global emissions will go up. And so it is just a function of the scale and magnitude, again, of the global energy system and how big it is, that those two, we're in the middle now of, people use the phrase clean energy transition, but that means moving away from something. Like, to be clear, in history, we have never moved away from anything. If someone says to you energy transition, you'll think in your head maybe of a chart from 1850 to today, from 0 to 100%. And as a percentage matter, we've seen these great shifts over time from wood to coal, and then coal to oil, and then gas, and increasingly, although still small, zero carbon energy. In total energy use, every one of those things is higher today, even wood, than it was in 1850, because population grows and global GDP grows. And so we're doing both of those things at the same time. In a new world of great power, competition, and rivalry, a major motivating force for, I mentioned a moment ago how we've gone to up to $2 trillion spent on clean energy. 40% of that is spending in China. And a major reason why the cost of clean energy has come down as much as it has is China. But the dominant role that China has in clean energy supply chains, more than 90% of solar panels, 70 to 90% of refining and processing of critical minerals, batteries, increasingly electric vehicles, which are not just cheap, but actually very good vehicles, are viewed in many ways. You want clean energy to be as cheap as possible so you can deploy it as fast as possible, but a concentration in any supply chain in one country, particularly one where you might perceive it to be a geostrategic adversary, is perceived as a risk, and cyber is a component of that. As the clean energy deployment, we know that a world that transitions to a low-carbon economy is going to be an electrified economy in very significant measure. Maybe not everything, but much more electrified than it is today. And there are benefits to some extent, as Europe learned recently with imported pipeline gas from Russia, or as we remember from the Arab oil embargo, to moving from globally traded hydrocarbons, inevitably exposed to geopolitical risk, to electricity. Electricity is much more local, not entirely, but more locally produced. Global trade in energy-related goods and services, according to the IEA, goes down around 60% in a net zero scenario. So there are security benefits from that. but there's also risks. And the electricity grid, we don't have a strategic electricity stockpile. The grid has to be perfectly balanced every second of the year. And the grid today, I mean, I don't know, I'm curious to hear my co-panelists, they know more about it than I do, has kind of a small margin for error in many parts of the country. Not as much of a buffer as you might want in a world that is facing worse risks in terms of cyber, in terms of severe weather events, and, as Harry said, in a world where we've lost muscle memory. We have how to deal with rising electricity demand, and suddenly electricity demand is projected to soar. We have an administration coming in that has promised to cut energy prices in half. I think not a partisan comment. That's not easy to do. But if you're worried about energy prices, and this election was a reminder people care about costs, I'd be more worried about electricity prices in the next couple of years than I would be about where oil prices are going. And there are a lot of things we do to build infrastructure again in this country, to modernize the grid, and to do utility reform. We can talk about what that means in various ways to just help to increase the reliability and modernize the grid. And cyber is a really important piece of that, particularly as we electrify more and more things. And the growth in clean energy, the scale of what we have to do is so big that it's very hard to do it without taking the demand side into consideration as well, and trying to use energy services, use energy more efficiently. And all of those demand side measures, create a lot of opportunity where devices are interconnected, but there's also cyber vulnerability there, obviously.
Sean, Jason's fantastic overview there of the tremendous diversity and complexity of dynamics at play connected wonderfully the epochal, global level kinds of dynamics to the very tangible local considerations of distribution of the grid, right? Like, there's basically 3 buckets when you're thinking about our energy ecosystem: your generation, where it's actually made; the transmission, like large quantities at high voltages moving places; but then the critical component of distribution, right? Where most of the mass of our energy ecosystem resides, where that electricity gets to people, to customers, to where it needs to go, and that is overwhelmingly state regulated. How are you, from your vantage point in the New York State, energy ecosystem, thinking about the challenges and opportunities of this transition and of the technological and cyber implications that are playing into that?
Yeah, thanks. And I think it was a great overview. You're absolutely right that as we're having this transition, we're seeing just so much of our critical infrastructure becoming both connected digitally, but then also on the electric sector itself. So I think back to the 2003 blackout, where you have the electric grid goes out, but everybody can still drive their car because it's gas powered. Today, we need to make sure that our sort of fundamental infrastructure, which is going to be more electric in the future, is secure. And I think that from the state perspective, we talk about these global threats, but at the distribution utility level, and from a regulatory perspective, we're really thinking about this through rate cases, and we're thinking about how do we take these priorities and turn them into something actionable at the level that impacts customers. From that perspective, and I think everybody here is going to be interacting with the grid for the most part at that distribution level. And to your point, all of that, nationally is regulated at the state level. So some states have been taking action, and I'm very proud of the action that we've been taking in New York. We have some great partners in the state legislature who helped us work on legislation that the governor signed 2 years ago that really sort of begins to get at this issue from the state perspective. And I would say one of the first things that we were able to do was put into our state energy law this prioritization of the security of critical energy infrastructure and some definitions. So this is now in our state law. It's a requirement that we focus on it. The other thing, and this I think came up on the healthcare panel too, was thinking about this from sort of an emergency response perspective. Last year we set into place another part of this legislation. We've enacted it now, where all of our utilities on an annual basis have to submit emergency response plans that take into account cybersecurity risks, but with a specific focus not just on customer data, but on the potential for blackouts to occur as a result of cyber attack. So that's a new thing. This is in our state regulation. It's in our state law. And we're continuing to work through this process of doing the implementation of the law that will include things like, for example, real-time monitoring of the grid for cyber attack. And that will include a heavy focus on this sort of what is the kinetic impact of a cyber attack, and what are the risks to people, at the very basic level of, can you turn on the light? And that's really where our focus is. I think that, broadly speaking, we have, we're obviously very plugged in with NARUC and Department of Energy as they're working through the distribution utility guidelines and these principles for cybersecurity. I think one of the challenges is sort of connecting this broad perspective on international sort of prioritization, and of course we see this in our clean energy transition. How do we sort of set ourselves up, relative to other actors across the globe? But at the public utility level, we also just need to think about this in the context of resiliency, reliability, and just the sort of the fundamentals of rate making, which is maybe a little boring, but this is the reality. This is sort of where I think, in New York, 22 million people are impacted at a very fundamental level by the decisions that are made in those contexts, and that's going to be the case nationally too. So I think that we're, as this transition continues, it's going to be just a fundamental part of this. Will need to be connecting the dots between what are the federal priorities and how do we sort of get them, implemented through that rate case basis.
Fantastic. Michele, as we connect those dots, how are industry and asset owners and operators integrating with that ecosystem, making sense and comprehending it, providing their feedback to refine it better? And how do you see that evolving alongside the energy transition and the new kinds of stakeholders coming into it?
Well, it's all around partnership, and there's so many partnerships, but when you look out at critical infrastructure, and 83% is owned and operated by the private sector, I've seen a transition in the last 20 years working with energy. When we used to have disasters, it was all natural disasters. You draw a circle around a region and the power was out. And it was storm response, and we have great mutual assistance. I'm sure you see when you have a hurricane, the trucks going down to Florida. They come from all over the country in Canada. Great teamwork, partnership, and collaboration, and it's from poles and wires. So we're talking about energy transition. We were talking about cyber, we're talking about physical, even last week, drones over power plants in Tennessee during the election. So there's all these variables, and we have to, look at our capabilities. We have to understand that, clean energy is here. We want safe, affordable, reliable, resilient strategies. But it has to come through partnership. So it's asset owners and operators, but it's working with our states. It's working with the governors. It's working with the regulators. It's going back into the federal government and working with our Sector Risk Management Agency, DOE. And there's a lot of priorities there, but who owns and operates? It's the asset owners and operators who have to implement, who have to keep the lights on, who are also dealing with the customers and want to make sure that things are affordable. And so there's a lot of factors here. And we're looking at strategy from various perspectives. So I work in DC. I'm not a lobbyist. I work with lobbyists. But what we're trying to do for the last 13 years is, when you said Superstorm Sandy, that was a transition point for our energy subsector of electricity. Superstorm Sandy is when our Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council became CEOs. And my CEO, Tom Fanning, became the co-chair, representing investor-owned utilities. And we also have municipals and cooperatives co-chairs. But that is the strategic arm of working with the federal government on resiliency and what we need to do. Many of what we're doing from a federal perspective needs to be incorporated down into the state level, especially when we get to this digital ecosystem where there are no islands and where there is interdependencies and dependencies. We're dependent, one of our Achilles heels is the communication sector. So how is communications as a sector working with their regulators and working through the FCC and CISA as their sector risk management agency? How are we going to incorporate what they're doing on that bad day and their plans with our plans? And so we're very good vertically from a federal perspective, but I think we can challenge ourselves and be better horizontally. We have to be interwoven across sectors, from the federal, state, local. When we get into cyber, international, space is becoming something that's an interdependency of everything that we have, and GPS, running the grid. And then we go back into the clean energy, which we're moving towards, supply chain. How are we challenging ourselves with supply chain? What are we looking at, and how are we bringing it in, and how are we having the conversations with the manufacturers, with the vendors? So there's a lot of dynamics, and there's a lot of partnerships and collaborations that have to be had, and I think we should challenge ourselves to remove from the silos and really have these priorities discussions.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just piggyback on that, I think you make a really great point that there are no islands anymore. And I think that traditionally the way that we've considered regulation is looking at these, these sort of centers that are very attractive to particular, threat actors. And so that's why you look at, a generator, a large generating facility. You look at bulk transmission infrastructure. But as we move forward, we're going to have a much more interconnected grid. We currently have a Grid of the Future proceeding at our Public Service Commission, where we're looking at the options for virtual power plants and how do we sort of implement this broader, more broadly. As a result, we're going to see at the distribution level, and again, this is certainly a national and an international phenomenon. We're going to see more sort of generation aggregated at this distribution level, with the potential for for threat actors to to be able to take advantage of whatever risks we sort of leave open there. So I think that's, to your point about there are no islands anymore. It's absolutely the case that we sort of have to take a top to bottom look at how this is going to work, and its function is going to be as critical to the clean energy transition as building more transmission infrastructure and and building out additional supply chains on clean energy infrastructure.
That's great, and it also reflects, I think, this conversation is bringing together by necessity a lot of stakeholders in the system that have not traditionally had occasion to do so. Much of my last year in the Biden administration was centered around corralling some of these uncommon collaborations. I came from the more kind of military-oriented offensive cyber side of things, but ended up spending much of my last year with the clean energy leadership in government because of these interesting questions and novel considerations for the much more technically sophisticated and digitally interconnected world of clean energy. And I found, as I co-chaired an effort to put together the kind of clean energy security priorities for this transition with our climate and clean energy friends, and we found that getting the glowering national security threat-focused people like me and my friends, and the affirmative vision, optimistic optimistic climate and energy folks on the other side of the table, just to speak the same language was a challenge. To be able to say, oh, I didn't know that that was possible if we actually did combine information and operational technology. Or in the other direction, it's like, wait, you're wanting to connect what to the internet now? Right. It's like all kinds of conversations there. And so, Jason, I would love to ask, like, what kinds of culture clashes you've seen in conversations about the global energy transition, particularly when it comes to supply chains in China. You had mentioned so much going on there. Do you feel like the folks who are worried about it, don't understand the centrality of or the difficulty of doing anything about it, or the folks who are invested in those Chinese supply chains are aware of what kinds of considerations they need to take into account?
Yeah, I think it's why, as you said, dialogue is so important, why work like we do at SIPA, or even within the Center on Global Energy Policy, which intentionally has expertise in sanctions and tariffs and trade and Saudi and Russia, with people whose expertise is energy, the energy transition, and climate change, because these issues are so cross-cutting. And I think often I don't know, Sean, if you like in discussions with the environmental community, I don't like to paint with a broad brush, and even the oil and gas industry, but China's often pointed to as a leader in the energy transition. And I understand, looking at some pieces of data, why that why people see that. There's tremendous growth in clean energy and renewables. The Chinese government generally recognizes that climate change is a reality. It is an incredibly large economy and a lot of people, and economic growth often trumps other concerns. So there's also a lot of coal still being used, still being built. Security, in part, they argue for reasons of resilience. We're not running these at capacity, but it's just there in case we need them. And we can be skeptical about whether, we'll see if that turns out to be true or not. But as I said a moment ago, my friend Jason Furman at Harvard, who's former economist, still an economist, formerly an economist for President Obama, I heard him at some point a couple of years ago, I think on my podcast, say, the words we use when we talk about climate change, which are justified by all the climate scientists here at Columbia and lots of words like existential, the threat we are talking, we don't really act like we believe those words to be true. So we have multiple policy objectives, of course, at any given time, and you need to balance a variety of things: economic growth, national security, politics. But if you really believe that to be true, as Jason said, you might care less about where your clean energy comes from than how cheap it is, because we have to deploy it much, much faster. But that's not our only concern. We have other values and other principles, like not using forced labor. Or playing by rules of free and fair trade. I see Merit Jana here. She knows more about that than any of us. And when you look at the actions, for example, taken by the Biden administration with tariffs applied toward Chinese manufactured clean energy products, solar panels, EVs, in many ways a continuation. It's one area of consistency across these two administrations. There are multiple rationales. It's national security, because EVs collect data and raise privacy and cyber concerns. We want to build domestically competitive industries. We can't maintain political support for the Inflation Reduction Act if everybody loses their jobs in Michigan in the process of implementing this. Chinese manufacturing is more carbon intensive. John Podesta gave a big speech at our conference in April about that. So there's all of these competing policy objectives we have. And I do think there's a real tension. I guess I'll put it this way. I think if you're going to address the new world of great power competition, security, economic, carbon concerns about the dominant position China has in clean energy supply chains, and try to meaningfully reduce that role and diversify those supply chains through trade policy, through domestic subsidies. This is a large, not a small headwind to the pace of the clean energy transition. And I just don't think we're having an honest enough conversation. It's kind of like, we have IRA subsidies and we have tariffs, and let's do some permitting reform, and we'll make it easier to build clean energy and do mining and refining and processing all over the United States. It's just the scale is too big for that to be a serious response. It's part of the response. But I do think we have to confront more the real tension that exists between these multiple policy objectives.
Extremely well said. And we need help in figuring out how to confront those tensions. And so now we're going to turn to the audience.
Yeah.
So is any questions here for our illustrious panel here today? Professor Healy, yes.
Great, thank you. As I think about, as we're looking at the energy transition, or even if it's not transition, just as we're bringing new things online, right? I tend to be really focused on which of them are most dependent on software, because the ones that are most dependent on software open up that attack surface. And so I'm just curious. I don't know who takes this, but for example, we heard the governor yesterday talking about the bring your own modular reactor as we're opening up, right? Are those software dependent, right? As we're thinking about, obviously as we're thinking about adding new things in to the grid that's doing generation, I imagine that's a very software intense process on timing and the other bits, but I'm not sure. So I'm curious, as someone that doesn't know the sector so well, like where are those areas that are most software intensive and that we need to start be thinking about our and maybe EV charging infrastructure, Hari, because I know you'd worked on that. Thanks.
Sure.
I can maybe jump in quickly. I think it's a great point, and I don't know if anybody here has ever had the pleasure of going into a very old power plant. It's a little bit like going into like Battlestar Galactica, and there's a reason why they did so well. So I think that we begin to see that as we are moving into this future where we need a much more responsive grid, it kind of requires that introduction of new software into the ecosystem. But it has these inherent risks that have to be addressed. And so I think, to your point, there's this constant sort of give and take in this transition between the need to be responsive, the need to sort of have this flexibility, combined with the need to sort of move forward into this new future. And I think that that's really the role, at least how I see, the role of the regulator as being the correct place to sort of mediate that dispute. And so I'm hopeful that we'll get that right. Hopefully the first time too. We'll see.
I'll add, especially since this allows me the opportunity to shamelessly plug the coming report from the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology on PRC technology, cyber risk, and clean energy. I think there's a way that you can consider a threat spectrum here in how you are going to prioritize your considerations. Solar panels are commodity sorts of technologies that are, they have semiconductors in them, but they are, generally speaking, very dumb, very cheap, and very systemically important to the clean energy transition. And they get aggregated up into inverters, right? And if you decided you wanted to try and do something nefarious, they would be very difficult with a relatively dumb solar panel. It would probably break down by the time you started working your way up the value chain. And so you can make a strong argument that solar panels are probably at the low end of what you should be worried about. On the other end of that spectrum might be like virtual power plant software, things that are entirely software defined and that directly control the dispatching and flow of electricity. And the good news is that re-architecting a software supply chain is easier than a critical mineral supply chain. And so I think you can create a spectrum there of what we'd want to be concerned about, both from a cyber risk perspective and how we would navigate the headwinds that Jason was talking about along the way there. Of course, the tricky part is where in the middle is the tipping point, but I think that we have the tools to be a little more empirical about it than just, everything's made in China, or it has to be not made in China. There's some nuance there that can help us have our cake and eat it too.
Can I just ask, I don't know if I'm allowed to, one of the examples you gave in your opening was colonial. It's not about a clean energy transition. Like the oil and gas industry is digitally connected, increasingly using tools of AI and other technologies, taking down the Saudi Aramco computer system, or colonial. Like, how unique are these two clean energy versus oil and gas?
Precisely, yeah. I think that that's exactly the question. And we have a situation right now where our energy ecosystem, while the transition is growing like gangbusters, is still mostly fossil-based and still mostly made up of technologies that are decades old and were never designed to be connected to the internet or digitized. But as per a couple rather alarming GAO reports in 23 and 21, are nonetheless being digitized, regardless of whether it is via clean energy or not. And in fact, I know that there's a lot of remote access and monitoring technologies.
If you go into the control room at Schlumberger, it's amazing. They're like a guy sitting at one desk controlling rigs and drilling activity all around the world.
Precisely, exactly. So like these questions are not unique to clean energy at all. But what I think the opportunity is with the clean energy transition is that these technologies are much more inherently digitally native and software defined and can be built from the ground up with security by design in mind, rather than, we have lots of great examples like that one of like very well put together, IT/OT combination of fossil tech, but for every one of those, there's 20 others where someone slapped a dial-up modem to the side of a dam, right?
I would just add, besides security, we're having the risk conversations on all of that.
Absolutely.
So I don't know, years ago if we were having the risk conversation. We may have been, partially the security, but we're really trying to go deep with the risk. And I think that's part of the equation.
Hear, hear.
Can I just do a quick follow-up?
Please.
Where does next generation nuclear fit into that, and when can we expect your report?
You can expect my report in the next few weeks, depending on White House pre-publication security clearance. Thanks for everyone out there watching. I think I'd probably kick it over to the rest of the panel on the question about advanced nuclear and the considerations there.
I guess I can jump in and just say that I don't think we know, but I think that as it sort of is a developing technology, it will have to fit into a sort of well-reasoned regulatory regime to ensure that it is implemented safely. So I think that's probably where it's at.
Software, like, is it super software dependent, or is it more digitally?
To be an armchair energy analyst here, I think that it's probably less of a software-intensive kind of proposition than a distributed energy situation would be. But if one of the advantages of your kind of small modular nuclear reactor is that it's more flexible, it can be turned up or down with more less control rod drama, then you could see novel software considerations there.
Thank you.
Yeah, Muniz.
Hi, I want to pull on two threads that came up. One is one that Professor Healy brought up around software. If you could talk about open source software, where you see that fitting in here, that doesn't fit under any regulatory regime, and there's a lot of open source providers, if you can call them that don't qualify as suppliers by any stretch of the imagination, but they're in energy management systems, they're in battery management systems, ubiquitous in battery management systems. So one question there. Second is about this risk regulation, the risk-based approach. I'm curious what lessons, if they are there, and Michele, this question is primarily for you, but interested for both of you as well, around the battery issue around cattle, transformer, industrial policy, and where that came into regulation, even in distributed energy resources, and the supply chain risk conversation. We need to have resiliency and redundancy, but all the providers are essentially from the PRC. So how do you live with that? And instead of asking, how do we live without it? Thanks.
Michele, do you want to take that second question first?
Sure. Ongoing. Thank you for the question. Great question, because it's continuous, right? The CATL, the batteries. Another partner that we work with in that would be the Department of Defense. And the conversations. So how do you influence the policy? How do you really understand the inventory? It's from the supply chain perspective, I've just seen an increase of these policy discussions in the last 2 years. From transformers to there's a union strike in getting in goods and from other countries, then also where they're coming in from. So you have someone like me who's trying to look at the risk and look at the strategy, working with our lobbyists, working internally with those that are on the EMS system who know the OT. It's just, I think we've got to get better at what I said before, having these conversations and putting the risk, because how I'm looking at the risk may not be how internally those who are running the EMS systems are looking at the risk. And then where are we using, the batteries? So we go out to your supply chain, and then they're learning geopolitical. They're learning, something that finance has always probably known in their digital world. We're having geopolitical conversations internally within our supply chains. Then we're going out and we're talking to our state regulators. And they know their energy, they know the needs, they know the customers, but do they understand the risk? And what's their influence? So I don't have a direct answer. I can say that it's on the table and I've seen it increase in the last 2 years. I don't think it's going away. I think we can challenge ourselves to be better and more informed and to have different skill sets and subject matter expertise around the table when we're talking about especially the supply chain.
And we're at time, so I will close us out with a quick note on the open source software question. I think that it mirrors a lot of the dynamics in the broader energy transition, where we're benefiting from the kind of democratized dynamism of technical experts who are not embedded in huge, traditional stakeholders who are bringing new ideas to the space, but also, if mobilized in the right way and told to look out for the right things, can be, a tremendous number more eyes and ears on what right looks like. Open source software, especially in more software-defined energy resources, is going to be foundational to the clean energy transition. A lot of VPPs, a lot of battery management software, a lot of OCS generally is based on open source, and we need as many eyes looking at that code as possible, and that's how we'll be able to build this more inherently defensible and more inherently secure and resilient system with the help of that transition. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you so much to my co-panelists, and thank you to Columbia and SIPA.